Hi, Professor.
Hello, how you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Little cooler today.
Oh yeah, this weekend it was really hot.
There.
Yeah, when I this weekend, because weekend I usually go to Balboa Park and do Confest, but this weekend had to go a little bit later so I don't get too hot because I'm walking around like all of Balboa Park.
Oh, it's amazing. I've been in San Diego for many years. I can't remember anything quite like this.
Oh, Professor, I want to share this with you.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, I carry this with me whenever I go protest,
Ah, hmm.
and I always have to wear this to protect myself just in case I get attacked.
Yes, unfortunately, these
I
days.
brought this all the way from Hong Kong.
Ah. Do you use
Oh,
an
Professor.
umbrella too? Do you use the umbrella?
Nah, I don't think the SD police would fire tear gas at me. I mean, it's a
Okay.
pre. I mean, in Hong Kong, when we go protest, it's peaceful unless the police start like getting violent on us.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, every time I read the news about the what the Hong Kong police is doing, it just makes me so upset. This weekend, I read that they just randomly tackled a 12-year-old girl to the ground for no reason.
Well, fear. I think that's what they're trading in. They want people to be afraid and not do anything. It's really sad.
Yeah, so it's really sad, and also what makes me really upset is so the Mulan movie that was just released, I found out some of it was filmed in Xinjiang, so a lot of people are not happy about that.
Yes, I just heard about that this morning. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah, I read several articles about Xinjiang and what they're doing to Uyghurs and Muslim minorities is terrible, like putting them in camps and CNN, Matt Rivers, he actually tried to go into Xinjiang to do a report, and he was being followed by government officials everywhere he went, even like checking his passports, IDs, like over 50 times during his 5 day trip there, and once even waking him up in his hotel at 1 a.m. just to check his passport, and he said, "Well, this is what happens when you do journalism here in Xinjiang."
yes. It's really a horrible thing happening there. And I wish our government was in a better place to help.
Yeah, I don't think that's gonna happen because we're living in fear as well in USA. That's why there is the spread of CCP here in USA. People are not standing up to China. They're like bowing down to them because they're we're living in fear, and China always threaten America with money.
Mm-hmm. So far, it's been working in many ways, unfortunately.
Yeah. I I was engaged to a girl from Kazakhstan, and she would tell me that she would have friends that went to because the Kazakhstan's right next to China, and once they cross, it's in Xinjiang. And she would tell me she would know people that went to Xinjiang and never came back, and suddenly they would get a call saying, "I really love it here in China. I don't think I ever want to leave again. It's like paradise." And that was it. And
Is it?
they do keep Kazakhs in camps there because they're Muslims.
Mhm. And it doesn't even make any sense. They should want them to leave so they won't be troublemakers, and yet they want to have control over all these people. It's
Yeah,
irrational. Yeah.
yeah. What CCP is they're destroying like Chinese traditional stuff that's been around for over like thousands of years. They're still doing it, and I read up they're still destroying like Buddhist temples,
Mm.
and yeah, in Tibet I heard they're still trying to cause a lot of trouble, and yeah, people say when you go to Tibet, there's actually the ironic thing is when you're in Tibet, you there's a lot of things about Tibet you cannot mention, like the Dalai Lama, or ask too much about their history, and there would be like monks pretending to, well, so-called monks, they're actually undercover agents, making sure people don't ask or say things that the government doesn't want to hear.
Yes, so they infiltrate the temples. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really sad. Like, I really want to go to Tibet one day. It's one of the top places I really want to visit, but I don't think that's gonna happen.
Mm.
And Bhutan is definitely one on my list, but it's wow, really expensive. Have you been there, Professor?
No, I have not.
Oh, yeah, there is a lot of Buddhism there.
Oh, yes, yes. I think it's going to come up in one of our PowerPoints today, actually.
Oh, great. Oh, I want to look through my journal from last year when I was in Korea. So I celebrated Buddha's birthday in Bongunsa Temple. Have you heard about it before?
And it's that in the Seoul area?
Yes. Hmm.
Yes, yes. I think I might even have visited it when I was there. I was there for a conference some years ago.
There's a really large statue of Buddha with something on his head, standing up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So according to my journal, when I went there were a lot of dancing, a lot of food, and my favorite part is and a lot of people lined up for this. People were lining up to bathe the Buddha, the little Buddha.
Ah, yes, that's part of the ceremony.
Mm.
They do that.
A lot of people.
They do that here in San Diego too. They used to do it in Balboa Park every year.
Oh, really?
Yes. Uh-huh.
I don't think we have that many Buddhist temples here. So I always go to Silai Temple whenever there's any like special ceremonies regarding the Buddha.
Yes, yes, it's a very nice temple.
Yeah, Silai Temple is definitely yeah, I do definitely feel like I'm in Asia once I'm in there.
Oh yes, it looks a lot like the original one in Taiwan. Beautiful.
Yeah, Taiwan also has a lot of interesting temples. When I was in Taipei, I went to Longshan Temple. What was it? I forgot the name. Longsai Temple. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Did you spend some time in Taipei as well, Professor?
Oh yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my husband's family lives there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you speak Mandarin, Professor?
一点点.
Oh, not bad, not bad.
I don't get.
When I learned Mandarin, when I learned Mandarin when I was 18, I actually learned Taiwanese Mandarin because my teacher was from Taiwan, and she would tell me, "Oh, you have to learn traditional Chinese and not all those simplified Chinese because it's not really Chinese writing. It's just communist writing. They try to destroy traditional Chinese culture." So when I speak Mandarin, people will say I would sound really Taiwanese, and it's good that I think traditional Chinese is better than simplified, and simplified Chinese it doesn't really look good.
Oh yeah, the original characters are so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shame to see them being left behind.
Yeah, and right now in Hong Kong, because of the national security law, my friends tell me that they're starting to promote simplified Chinese in schools now.
Yes, I heard.
And forcing people to sing the Chinese national anthem, and disrespecting the Chinese national anthem would result in jail time.
Yeah.
It's really sad what's happening in Hong Kong, and I can't go back to Hong Kong as a result. It's not the Hong Kong I knew when I was younger. So when people ask me to sing the Hong Kong national anthem, I always sing the British national anthem because that's the one I grew up with.
Well, this is one of those cases where Buddhist impermanence is a wonderful thing because things will always change. People tend to think that impermanence is somehow negative, but And I think maybe we better get started. And first I'm going to see if there's any... Yeah, that's fine. Any questions from last time that anyone had? Anything we need to take care of before we move on? Because we're getting into a very deep article here, very philosophical, written by Kenneth K. Yanada. I actually knew him as one of the outstanding scholars of Buddhism in America in the last century. And in this one article, it is very packed with information that relates to the sorts of things that we've been talking about here. And we talked about the problem of our perceptions of Buddhism. He uses a more philosophical term, basic misconceptions of Buddhism. So we already, I think, took a look at this particular quote. No view is seeing, which can see all things. If one has any views about things, this is not seeing anything. So what he's trying to do is to help us to let go of our views, perceptions, misconceptions of Buddhism. But the basic ones, there's more than the ones he's going to cover. So I always want to point out to people that this image is not from Inada's essay. So very often when people would write about Inada's essay, they would refer to this as Inada's Buddha, Inada's elephant. But I'm just using this as a way to kind of see these diluted perceptions of Buddhism that we've been talking about. And you can find this discussed in the Titha Sutta, which is one of the early texts in Buddhism. So you might be familiar with the story of the blind men and the elephant. They didn't know what an elephant was, but they were introduced to this thing, but each of them is experiencing a different part of the elephant. So the one who's looking at the tusks concludes that it's a spear. The one who looks at or feels, because they're not really looking at it, feels the ears, thinks it's a fan. The one who's on the side of the body thinks it's a wall. And then the one who is touching the tail thinks it's a rope. Another one is touching the leg and sees it as similar to a tree trunk. And another one has the front part of the elephant and thinks it's a snake. So it's grounded in their experience, but then they take the sensory experience and they interpret it in terms of what they had known before. So this is very similar to what Professor Inada is trying to warn us about. You're trying to very often import what you've already experienced into this new experience, which is Buddhism. And so these red terms that we have here, those are among the misconceptions of Buddhism, that it's pessimism, that it's nihilism, that it's metaphysics, that it's religion, that it's believing in life as illusory, and that it believes in heaven and hell. So they're not completely wrong. There's a resemblance, but the resemblance is not enough to come to these conclusions. So that's why the perception, the experience is ultimately diluted. So what's left? All of these terminologies that are applied for thousands of years in philosophies really don't apply to Buddhism. So we have to step outside of our comfortable categories and try to see what's really there, not what we expect to find. So that's, I think, the primary lesson that we can learn from Professor Inada. And so that's why I use this image. I call it the none of the above. Buddhist philosophy is none of the above. Is anyone familiar with this particular creature? Have you seen this before?
Is that a platypus?
Yeah, it's a duck-billed platypus. And San Diego Safari Park now has a pair of duck-billed platypuses as of last fall. I actually was able to see them last October when they were first put on display. I use this as an image because when people Europeans first came upon the knowledge of the duck-billed platypus, mostly dead carcasses, they didn't believe there was such a thing because it didn't fit any of their expectations. Or like the elephant, had different parts. So it is duck-billed, so you look at the front and it seems to resemble a duck, and yet it has a furry body and it has claws. So it looks like it's a combination of a variety of different animals that have been put together. In fact, it's a rather rare egg-laying mammal. There aren't very many of them in the world today. And so it doesn't fit neatly into the usual categories. So this is a quote from our friend Inada. The most phenomenal and magnificent feat of Buddhism in its adventurous spread, and we talked about how far-flung the influence of Buddhism was across Asia, has been the transformation of all Asia into a religious and philosophical unity. So many people might come across this quote and be puzzled. For one thing, the role of Buddhism today seems to be fairly minimal, but he's talking about 1,000 years ago when Buddhism was the dominant religion / philosophy throughout Asia, particularly through the Silk Road and Central Asia. And therefore, it did transform religion and philosophical traditions in Asia and brought them together. So we talked about how, for example, on the Korean Peninsula, Buddhism was the one thing the warring kingdoms actually agreed on, and that became the kind of cement that allowed them to unify under the Silla dynasty. So in terms of what Inada wants to talk about, he says the discussion which follows is based as nearly as possible on the philosophic insights into the nature of things gained by the historical Buddha. So what he's trying to do is get back to the original primary source, which is the historical Buddha, and to hone in our attention to the philosophy that the Buddha had concerning reality, the nature of things. So that's why I find this to be a wonderful philosophical text for us to start with. And we've been talking around Buddhism and general concepts, but here he's trying to really get us into the philosophy of Buddhism outside of other conceptions, perceptions, and misconceptions. So any questions at this point? It's important to see what his methodology is and what he's trying to accomplish. So he starts out not by discussing this series of misconceptions, but where do they come from? So there are these misconceptions, but he wants to know what is the source. And he has located 3 sources. One is ideological, one is historical, and one is linguistic. And again, that's important because we have some distortions, some distorted views of what constitutes Buddhist philosophy. And there are a variety of ways in which these distortions could have arisen. But we can, again, categorize them in these 3 ways. So let's start with ideological. So we talked a little bit, I think, last week about ideology. And although if you look at the original etymology, it is the logos of ideas, logos or the study of ideas, but that's not the way it tends to be used, let's say, in a philosophical context. So people use it in many different ways, but here we're interested in philosophy. So this is a quote from a philosopher talking about the problems of political philosophy. So you see ideology used very often in a political context. And what he tells us is that ideology is usually taken to mean a prescriptive doctrine that is not supported by rational argument. So that doesn't really seem to fit with the logos of ideas, but that's the way people, particularly philosophers, tend to use the term. And I think that's also significant in terms of what Inada is telling us. So people don't have a very rigorous idea about what Buddhism is, but they also are trying to promote it. They make a prescriptive doctrine lacking support. But philosophy is always looking for the evidence. And included in his discussion, Inada points to many of the sources of evidence that are used for him in recreating Buddhist philosophy. So he makes references to a variety of texts, particularly the primary texts that contain the lectures of the Buddha. So he wants to warn us here about the difficulty of looking at Buddhism. Buddhism and Buddhist doctrines do not lend themselves to rapid understanding. It simply takes years, if not a whole lifetime, to grasp the true meaning and teachings of Buddhism. So it looks perhaps simplistic, but there are multiple layers when we're, again, looking at it from a philosophical point of view. And he also points to the cause, because they are, one, not subject to mere intellectual or logical analysis. It's very important to look at that word that I highlighted, I put in bold, mere. There are ways to intellectually and logically analyze Buddhist philosophy, but there's also more to it than that. That would be the tip of the iceberg. That would be the linguistic conceptual analysis. But there's the experiential analysis that is much more difficult to arrive at, and that would involve the awakening experience. The second problem, cause of this complexity, are the interrelated and interpenetrative concepts. So these notions of Buddhist meaning, Buddhist teaching, they are all related to one another. So when you look at just one piece, you're not seeing the full picture. The more pieces you look at, the better able you are to look at the full picture and see what the Buddha is trying to get at. Any questions about that?
Well, I had a quick question. So in one, it says like not subject to mere intellectual or logical analysis. So would this class be considered of the intellectual and logical analysis and not so much of the other part, right? Like this class would be an example?
Well, we are providing the finger pointing at the moon. So we are basically looking at the intellectual and logical analysis philosophically of Buddhism. But at the same time, the readings that we're looking at represent different Buddhist practitioners trying to communicate something that is basically impossible to communicate. So as we work our way through the semester, we'll find that Buddhists are turning to things like body language rather than just verbal language, making use of the arts. So the arts can be a way to communicate something that is beyond intellectual and logical analysis, and how that is not a betrayal, but actually very supportive of the intention of the Buddha. So that's a very good question to bring up. Other questions or clarifications here? One of the other things I like about Inada's essay is that he provides a wonderful model for how to do your own philosophical writing. Very clear, very concise, offering evidence, setting forth very clearly, in this case, the sources of the misunderstandings and the causality behind it. So all of that is a wonderful example of how philosophy ought to be done, so that it doesn't become ideology. Okay, so the second source is historical. Even early Buddhists didn't quite understand what the Buddha was saying. So even at the time that the Buddha was alive and he was teaching the doctrine that we're going to be looking at soon of non-self, non-Atman, many of his closest followers just didn't quite get it. They thought, well, he doesn't really mean that we don't have this single, separate, independent identity. And after he was gone, some of them actually brought it back. So even though they're listening to the words of the Buddha, doesn't mean that they were safe from misinterpretations. And then he has a very interesting comment here. In spite of distortion, or even because of it in some cases, Buddhism kept on spreading. So one of the things you find Inada talking about is that a lot of people who think they're Buddhists or claim to be Buddhists they're prone to these misconceptions. And that's why it's very important to be very clear about what is and is not part of the teaching of the historical Buddha. So those distortions sometimes made Buddhism seem much more attractive as it was moving from one culture to another. I think I saw a chat question. Did we have something here? Well, we're not to the misconceptions yet. These are the sources of the misconceptions that we're talking about right now. So their sources of the misconceptions are first ideological, second historical, and third linguistic. And then we're going to look at the list. So language, we've already, I think, indicated the problematic aspect of language. So language is our primary tool of communication, and yet from a Buddhist perspective, and generally speaking from the perspective of most Asian philosophies, it has limitations. So one of the things about Buddhism is when Buddhists sent missionaries to other cultures, they didn't require the new culture to learn Pali or Sanskrit so that they could read the texts. One of the first things missionaries would do is set up a translation center, and they would recruit people from the native population to work with them who were native speakers of Pali and Sanskrit, and they would jointly put out translations so that they could use these indigenous languages to express the new doctrines in the mood and spirit of the people concerned. So they're trying to make it more accessible to new populations. In some philosophies, it is assumed that you have to look at the text in the original language. Now, this actually works in Buddhism to a certain extent because language, even for a native speaker, has its inherent limitations. So we, as he says, we must be warned of facile and forced adaptations of ideas, all of which lead to some of the basic misconceptions which will now be discussed. So in many cases, it was just a mistranslation that led people into a misconception of what the Buddha was trying to communicate. Okay, so those are, again, the three sources, and now we're going to look at the misconceptions. Any questions so far? So basically what's happening is an attempt to force this unique philosophy of Buddhism, this none of the above philosophy, into convenient and comfortable pigeonholes. You might be familiar with the notion of a pigeonhole, more like these little mailboxes on the bottom, but it comes from actually little pens for pigeons. So when you pigeonhole things, you put them in their designated spot. So when people look at concepts and doctrines in Buddhism, they say, oh yeah, I know what that is. I studied it in this other philosophy, so they must be talking about the same thing. And that's where the problems arise. And again, this is not from Ananda, but I think it might be helpful. This is a result of what we could call the Procrustean bed scenario. This comes from Greek mythology. Got some really interesting mythological figures in ancient Greece. And there's this guy called Procrustes. He was a highwayman. He would rob travelers on the road. But he also had this really bizarre problem about height. So he would take them to his lair and put them on his bed, and that's what's happening here. He's taking his victim. And if they didn't fit the size of the bed, he would either stretch them so they would fit exactly, or he would lop off parts of their body that were hanging over the edge. So it looks like here he's trying to lop off some of this guy's, maybe his foot, so that he'll actually fit the bed. And so what happens when you put something in a Procrustean bed, you don't get a complete picture of what it actually was. You either stretch it out of existence, or you remove things that you consider unnecessary. And that is what happens with these misconceptions. We're trying to make this very unique philosophy fit our common ideas and experiences. Okay. So everybody get a sense of that. We're either putting something into the text which is not actually there, or we're removing something that we just don't like. Okay, so the first, and what he tells us the biggest and most damaging misconception of Buddhism is pessimism. And it's so important that we're going to actually spend more time on this one than any of the others. And mainly, he says this is due to a misunderstanding of the experience of dukkha. That people look at the Fourfold Noble Truth and they don't look at the connections between all four. So as he says, if the Noble Truths are taken in their entirety, which is the only way to understand them, then there will be no room for pessimism, but rather only for an emphasis on optimism. So as you know, the Four Noble Truths start out with life is suffering, or as I reworded it, life is experienced as suffering, or dukkha. But that's just the opening observation. And then we go on to see that there is a way to remove dukkha. So first we have to admit the problem, and then we have to look at the cause and effect relationship. So we know that tanha is the source of the dukkha. Eliminate the tanha, you eliminate the dukkha. How do we eliminate the tanha? That's where we get the Eightfold Path. So also extremely important, that's why I put it in bold. How do you address the problem of dukkha? And this is what the Buddha advises: by careful observation, rationalization, accommodation of facts, and eventually self-mastery. This is what the Buddha provides for us in his teachings. Observe how dukkha arises, figure out the cause and effect relationships, see how that fits into the causes and conditions of your own life, and then learn how to deal with it. Learn how to remove the sources of dukkha, which is the tanha. And that's why we're going to move over to another PowerPoint here in just a second, but we got one more slide here. And we have to look carefully at the difference between pain and suffering. So dukkha is usually translated as suffering, but that's not the same as pain. And I came across this interesting article by an American who had moved to Germany, and there she had some minor surgery, and she was very unhappy with the way that they dealt with her physical pain. As she says, she admits, I use ibuprofen like candy. Why else do they come in such jumbo sizes at American warehouse stores? So the response, as an American, she's telling us, is all pain must be crushed. But on the other hand, we see something different. This is another source. What is the difference between pain and suffering? Pain is fundamentally a psychological phenomenon. So she's trying to treat her pain, but actually it's her suffering, her psychological experience of the physical pain that is causing her distress. And that's something that, to some extent, is culturally conditioned. So if pain is fundamentally a psychological phenomena, you can learn specific skills to calm your nervous system, thereby dampening pain and processing in your brain and spinal cord. So used regularly, these skills can work as effectively as medication to ease pain and related distress. So this goes back to what we saw, how the Dalai Lama talks about the importance of mind, that the mind actually contributes to our experience of suffering, which is distinct from our experience of pain. Pain is physical, suffering is psychological. Now, what they also found, relating it directly to Buddhism, is the role of meditation. Meditation gives your brain control and helps you focus less on pain, thereby directly reducing pain and suffering. So meditation is a technique, is a methodology that is utilized by the Buddha, but also now being recognized in medical circles as something that really can deal with both physical pain and psychological suffering. Does everybody see that difference? Because it's extremely important. Buddhism is interested in the suffering part. That's what we can deal with. The physical pain is one thing, But what our mind does with the physical pain, that's what creates the suffering or the dukkha. Any questions about that? Okay, so I'm going to stop this one, and we'll get back to that on Thursday. And we will take a deep dive into suffering. Don't worry, the end is going to be joy. Okay, so any questions at this point? So because Inada emphasizes that this idea of pessimism is the biggest and most damaging misconception of Buddhism, I think it warrants, as I said, a deep dive into this whole notion of suffering, or why Buddhism is not pessimistic. So even though the Buddhists talk about suffering, that's a recognition of the human condition, but it also is more concerned about putting an end to suffering. That's where he really starts his teaching, as we'll see. So here's an interesting quote. I have not been able to identify it as specifically Buddhist, but I think it fits. There can be no island of peace in an ocean of suffering. So when the Buddha awakens and realizes the connection between Tanha and dukkha, he is able to deal with the problem of suffering, but he still awakens to a society where people are literally living in an ocean of suffering. And therefore, he wants to share the techniques that can address that problem. So dukkha, as I said, generally translated as suffering, can also be looked at as dis-ease. So disease is a lack of ease. It includes varying degrees of discomfort. And I also suggested, I think the first week, that we can translate it perhaps today as dysfunctionality. Something is just not working for us. And dysfunctionality can be experienced as minor, or it can be something that's major. So dukkha is a mental construct, unlike pain, which is actually a physical experience. Any questions about that?
Yeah, really quickly, this couldn't be translated as desire, right?
No, desire is what causes the dukkha.
Right, but dukkha itself doesn't mean desire.
No, it's the after effects. It's the negative after effects of desire as attachment or aversion. Or
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you.
That's a good clarification. Anything else here? Okay, so what we have is, in Buddhism, we call it the discriminating mind. We like to look at extremes. So on the one hand, there's pain, and then there's suffering. There's pleasure and there's joy. So the pain and the pleasure are sensory experiences. Suffering and joy are the mental response. So our response to physical pain is suffering. Our response to sensory pleasure can be, among other things, joy. So this is emotional, it's psychological, and it's also intellectual. So it's the mind that is really creating the experience, or let's say shaping the experience, or editing the experience. So let's take a look at something like bullying, being victimized by virtual reality. Now, when I was growing up, we used to have this little song we would sing, or when we were being bullied. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. So the physical pain of someone throwing stones and sticks at you, that does have a painful outcome. But that would be separate from people using words to attack you. Now, unfortunately, in the midst of virtual reality, people do have an overdose of that suffering. And we know that bullying online has led to very extreme actions, including suicide by people who have been victimized that way. So this is another example of the differentiation between pain and suffering and the interconnection between the two. So the Buddha is not dealing with the pain, but the effect of pain through the experience of suffering or dukkha. So in Man's Search for Meaning, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, written by Viktor Frankl, he actually describes his experience as an inmate in a Nazi concentration camp. And he himself had a background in psychology and psychiatry, and therefore he could bring his professional expertise to that horrible experience. And so he analyzes exactly what we've been talking about here, the difference between the physical pain and the suffering, and which one is actually the worst. So as he tells us, it's not the physical pain which hurts the most. And obviously there was a lot of that in the concentration camps. It is the mental agony caused by the injustice, the unreasonableness of it all. And because he saw the distinction between those two, he put a lot of emphasis on trying to deal with the mental agony using his own training. And the worst experience he had, he describes to us, we could call it the dukkha of dehumanization. So of all the things that happened to him in the camp, the very worst day of his life in the camp was the psychological suffering when he was out digging a ditch. That was the job that the prisoners were assigned. And just for a moment, he stopped to take a breath. And the guards saw him doing that, and they treated him in a dehumanizing way. They didn't yell at him. They didn't point a gun at him. One of the guards just picked up a rock and threw it at him. And it made him feel like he was just some kind of animal. They didn't see him as a human being, but they were just trying to get his attention to get him back to work the way that you might throw something at an animal. And to him, that was the worst suffering that he had throughout the entire almost 4 years in the camps.
I think a really good example of somebody trying to overcome that mental suffering and that mental persecution is from the movie Life is Beautiful. I don't know if you've seen it.
No.
It's a movie about World War II at the Nazi concentration camps, but it's a father and a son get sent to the concentration camps, and the father is a comedian by profession, and he's trying to make it seem like this is all a game for his son. So his son doesn't really get that mental suffering the way everybody else does in the concentration camps.
Mm-hmm. So the power of the mind to either induce dukkha or to help us deal with the dukkha. It works both ways. So we can see this problem of dukkha as hugging the porcupine. I had a friend who was a psychologist, and years ago he told me that's what he tells his patients, that when they come in and they're complaining about their lives, he tells them that they're hugging the porcupine. And you certainly don't want to suggest people do that because it can be very painful. They just couldn't let go of that pain. And there's an interesting way in which particularly American culture prioritizes pain. And in Buddhism, it's quite the opposite. Pain is not a good thing. It's something you want to avoid because that pain is what can lead to the dukkha. So we have comments like this. This is a comment from Nietzsche that is often used. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. What sounds, oh, wow, that's so powerful. But remember, the other choice is it kills me. So what you want to do is put yourself in positions where you are liable to be killed. And if you're not killed, that makes you stronger. Another similar kind of comment here, pain is weakness leaving the body. So this seems to be exactly what Siddhartha, before he became the Buddha, believed. He was a practitioner of the Vedic religion, and that included forms of practice that induced physical pain, because they believed exactly what Nietzsche and this other comment is saying. He believed that was true, that asceticism would set him free, that if he could survive that physical pain, that he would be able to merge his Atman with Brahman. But it didn't work. And then he awakened to the Fourfold Noble Truth, and he rejected this no pain, no gain kind of mantra. So I'm going to skip a couple of these because I put more into the PowerPoint than I thought we could cover, and you can go back and take a look at it. This is something you find in many religions, for example. Aztec religion used sacrifice as a very important ritual, something that was practiced by the gods and was required for the creation of the universe. Rulers also sacrificed parts of their body and their blood through self-mutilation and self-sacrifice. And they thought that this was a means to maintain social and cosmic order. Again, this is not the only early religion that felt that way. No pain, no gain. You have to give something to get something. Interestingly enough, they also considered women who died in childbirth to be warriors who had fallen in battle. So they had given their lives, they sacrificed their lives to give birth. So death as the price of life. And this Spanish version of that was given to me by one of my students in the past. So external challenge, live with the pain, test one's mettle, prove one's worth, pain management, when bad things happen to good people, all of that assumes that we are trying to endure pain, live with the pain, just learn how to live with it. Buddhism is saying something very different. So again, Siddhartha believed this sort of thing. Get beyond the pain. The problem that he finally assessed is that it was an internal problem. The self is the obstacle. So what we need to do is to let go of the pain, not hugging the porcupine. You don't have to prove your worth because you're already worthy. We're going to talk about this as what I call the ugly duckling syndrome. You already are what you just misidentified yourself. Meditation is one of the techniques that you can use to let it go. And we essentially are self-troublemakers. And since we are the ones who create the tanha that leads to dukkha, we are also able to eliminate the tanha and therefore eliminate the dukkha. So instead of being passive, trying to cope with that pain, we can be active and interactive. So a very different way of dealing with these kinds of issues. So why don't we let go of the dukkha? Why is it that we would assume no pain, no gain? Well, we do seem to have a problem with happiness. People quite often write books actually demeaning the whole notion of happiness. There's a guy who wrote Against Happiness in Praise of Melancholy. So that, again, that seems to be something ingrained in our culture. So some people think that being happy is demeaning, whereas Buddhism believes that happiness is something to be valued. And these are two very interesting sources, both you might say in a religious context. Pope John Paul II thought that no pain, no gain is what it requires to be a saint. So he flagellated himself regularly to imitate Christ's suffering, engaged in a practice known as self-mortification, which was also the kinds of practices used in Vedic religion, the self-infliction of pain in order to feel closer to God, the practice of self-denial and asceticism. Again, asceticism is something the Buddha let go of when he became awakened. And then we have the Dalai Lama, who actually wrote a book called The Art of Happiness, a handbook of living. And I remember when it first came out, it was a bestseller, but I read a review in the Los Angeles Times, and The reviewer was actually criticizing him. He's a spiritual leader. He got the Nobel Prize for Peace. Why is he writing a book about happiness? It's beneath his dignity as a religious leader to write such a book. So those are the people who are demeaning the whole notion of happiness and embracing the no pain, no gain. And this is a comment from one of my students back in spring 2016 that I'd like to share with you. He says, as a musician, I was taught that to a certain degree, pain makes good art. No pain, no gain. Sacrificing oneself for the craft is what makes it truly meaningful. Ever since hearing that might not be the case, and the most meaningful things might be better made from a mindset of remaining unattached in the present, I have pondered how to properly get to the place where pain and suffering does not have to happen for my music to take on a life of its own. So he started questioning that mantra. Any comments about this? Do you find yourself unconsciously adopting the no pain, no gain mantra?
I think when it comes to art, the reason that a lot of people think that one must suffer in order to produce art is that a lot of the most successful artists and musicians and whatever it is have had, you know, challenges in their lives and have had to overcome adversity in many ways.
But is the adversity what makes them excellent artists? That causes
No,
a relationship.
I think the art is already within them. It's just they kind of use their experiences as part of their art.
Mm-hmm. So at the very least, Buddhism asks us to reconsider that relationship, just as this student was trying to do.
Yeah.
Just seeing that maybe it's different. So the perception, particularly the cultural perception, requires us to apply what we've discussed as great doubt. Let's start questioning what we think we know or what we've been told is true.
May I?
Yes.
Also, pain gives art a certain quality of drama, which I think is difficult to achieve if you are peaceful and balanced.
Well, we're going to take a look at some Buddhist art and let's see what you think about it.
Okay.
So that's a very interesting point. Yes, we'll have a series of test cases, especially when we get to the Japan section. Other comments? So we're going to be working our way towards from no pain, no gain to happiness, and eventually, as I said, joy. So why Buddhists are happy? There's actually been a lot of scientific studies done about this. When you see a statue of the Buddha, you usually see him with what they sometimes call the Mona Lisa smile. And here is a Buddhist saying, how can you make yourself happy? Is there a way to calm the mind? Yes, it is to let go of things. Why do you not want to let go? Because you have not suffered enough. In other words, you think you have not suffered enough. No pain, no gain. When you have suffered enough, you will know that you should throw away your sufferings as soon as possible. So note how this supports what Inada was telling us. Buddhism is not about pessimism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of that. Throw away your sufferings. Don't cling to them. Yes, we experience life as suffering. That doesn't mean it has to be that way because you think you have not suffered enough. Certainly that's what Siddhartha thought when he became a Vedic practitioner. So here is some scientific research. This is from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So Richard Davidson found that the left prefrontal lobes of experienced Buddhist practitioners light up consistently rather than just during meditation. So it doesn't just happen to you when you're meditating. Persistent activity in the left prefrontal lobes indicates positive emotions and good mood. So you can actually see in their brain why they seem to be happy. Whereas persistent activity in the right prefrontal lobes indicates negative emotion. The first Buddhist practitioner studied by Davidson showed more left prefrontal brain activity than anyone he had ever studied before, meaning that they had the highest level of positive emotions and good mood shown by their brain than anyone that he had used as a subject. So something is happening there. Another study, New York University. We know that a person can be conditioned via their amygdala and thalamus, parts of the brain, to be scared of things that really aren't worth being scared of. We also know that it is extremely hard to override what the amygdala thinks and feels simply by conscious rational thought. Some fascinating early work suggests Buddhist mindfulness practice might tame the amygdala. And in fact, in another study, they found that the amygdala of Buddhist practitioners, those who do it on a regular basis, is actually smaller than that of the average person. So a renowned researcher on basic Darwinian emotions has found that experienced meditators don't get nearly as flustered, shocked, or surprised as ordinary people by unpredictable sounds, even those as loud as gunshots. Buddhists often profess to experience less anger than most people. So there's actually something happening in the brain. They call that neuroplasticity. Buddhist meditation and mindfulness, developed 2,500 years before Prozac, can lead to profound happiness, and its practitioners are deeply in touch with their glowing left prefrontal cortex and their becalmed amygdala. So we have scientific evidence. This is also connected with the wandering mind. Whatever people were doing, they tended to be happier if they were focused on the activity instead of thinking about something else. And focus, of course, is the awareness that is essential for meditation. Evidence for mind wandering causing unhappiness, but no evidence of unhappiness causing mind wandering. So when your mind is wandering all over the place, you're more likely to be unhappy. Okay, so let's move on. Buddhist responses to suffering. I'm going to move on a couple of these. This is the woman with the surgery in Germany. Her anesthesiologist told her pain is a part of life. We cannot eliminate it, nor do we want to. The pain will guide you. But how does she deal with the pain? Does that pain necessarily have to turn into suffering? Also, interesting note, 80% of all prescription painkillers in the world are used by just one country. Anybody want to guess which country that is?
The
USA.
That's right. We're number one. So this is actually a Buddhist parable that was sent to me by one of my nun students some years ago. And it gives us another way, kind of an artistic way, to try to understand the message of Buddhism. So it's about a farmer's donkey who falls into a well, and he's crying in the well, and the farmer doesn't know how to get him out. But then the farmer decides, well, the animal's old, the well needed to be covered up anyway, it wasn't worth it to retrieve the donkey. So he invites his neighbors to come over and help him, and they grab a shovel and they begin to shovel dirt into the well. That's not the Buddhist part, that's the nasty part. At first, the donkey realized what was happening and cried horribly. Then, to everyone's amazement, he quieted down. A few shovel loads later, the farmer finally looked down the well and was astonished at what he saw. With every shovel of dirt that hit his back, the donkey was doing something amazing. He would shake it off and take a step up. And as the farmer's neighbors continued to shovel dirt on top of the animal, thinking that they were going to bury him, they were actually unconsciously helping him, he would shake it off and take a step up. Pretty soon, everyone was amazed as the donkey stepped up over the edge of the well and trotted off. Hope he got away from that farmer.
I was just going to ask, did he bite the farmer?
It's just an allegory. So life is going to shovel dirt on you, all kinds of dirt. That's the underlying message. The trick to getting out of the well is to shake it off and take a step up. Each of our troubles is a stepping stone. We can get out of the deepest wells just by not stopping, never giving up. Dalai Lama actually has a poem that he calls Never Give Up. Shake it off and take a step off. So 5 simple rules to be happy. One, free your heart from hatred, which is one of the three poisons you might remember. Free your mind from worries. I think we could relate that to the problem of ignorance. Live simply, give more, expect less. And I believe my student, non-student, was trying to use this story to represent Buddhist philosophy. This is a related article. Top 5 components of happiness: possession of basics, food, shelter, good health, safety, get enough sleep, have relationships that matter. Number 4 is very much a part of Buddhism: take compassionate care of others, have work or an interest that engages you. So liberation versus accumulation. So what really is happiness? What is the Buddhist talking about here? What constitutes that? It's been said that we are amusing ourselves to death. So the premise here is that maybe we really don't know what happiness is all about. Maybe we have, again, another misconception or deluded perception about happiness. So how do we seek happiness? Are we trying to escape something? Mindless activity, mind wandering, to suppress the dukkha, or to mask it using drugs, entertainment, or sensory overload? Or are we engaging in a mindful examination of dukkha on the sources that are available to us to address the situation? So I think you can see that engagement is the option of Buddhism. And so this brings us to a very interesting case of the Buddhist kingdom of Bhutan, which has been promoting gross national happiness for quite a few years now. It's the alternative to the GNP, and it espouses materialistic values in terms of prosperity. We think of economic prosperity, and what they're saying is they want to see how much happiness they can provide for the people in their country. And they've got it down to different dimensions: psychological well-being, time use, community vitality, culture, health, education, environmental diversity, living standard, and governance. Notice none of this says how much money is in the average person's bank account or what their yearly salary is. So it's a different way to calculate what is valuable. Bhutan's story today is, in one word, survival. Gross national happiness is survival. How to counter a threat to survival. So many people would not want to change the economic stats that we tend to use, but it really depends on how one perceives value in life. I'm going to skip a couple. All right, so now we want to go from happiness to joy. So the word that you find that's more operative in the Buddhist text would be joy. It goes beyond happiness. So undo self-imposed dukkha. So since we're the ones who are creating the dukkha based on our tanha, this is something that we can control. We have these prickly intellectual porcupines we're hugging. We have delusional perceptions we have to deconstruct. And most importantly, perhaps, we have to know what our true identity is, not the Atman that we've been conditioned to believe constitutes our identity. So these are some images that are used by a Buddhist nun. She's actually the same one who did the picture of the dog we looked at, the thinking, saying, and doing. And so how would you implement this kind of advice? Not everyone in the world needs to be a sage. You can vow to be a drop of water to nourish plants. You can vow to be a flower to beautify the environment. You can vow to be a tree to provide shade for others. As long as you have the dedication to do it, any vow will blossom and bear good results. So there's lots of ways to contribute, not just to your own happiness, but joy requires being concerned about the happiness of the world in general. So thinking good thoughts, giving others joy, and doing good deeds with the thumbs up, kind of a modern version. Random acts of kindness. And this is the cover of the book. So this is a contemporary Korean master, and every year they have a big celebration for the Buddha's birthday. And so he wrote this poem for his devotees, and it's Buddha's birthday, but what he's saying is Buddha's birthday is really about you giving birth to your Buddha. So take a good look at yourself. Take a good look at yourself, transcend time and space, and you'll see that you are eternal. You are infinite. Remember the quote from Hakuin, forget yourself and become the universe. Should the universe collapse and disappear, you would still be immovable. You are all forms, all formlessness in the universe itself. You are the twinkling stars and the dancing butterflies. You are everything. Doesn't sound very pessimistic, does it? Take a good look at yourself. All truths are within you. To look for truth outside yourself is to search for water outside of the ocean. And that image is actually used quite often in particularly Zen literature. Take a good look at yourself. There is no death in eternity, but those who don't know themselves worry about death. They fret about it and they dread it. Take a good look at yourself. You are originally pure gold. But because you are blinded by personal profit and greed, you mistake this gold for alloy. You don't even know who you are. Forget your selfishness and use all your energies to help others. If you remove all traces of greed and desire, the I, the Buddha I, will open up and you'll see yourself as you really are, pure gold. So it's a perception problem. Take a good look at yourself. Poverty and starvation are superficial realities. The poor and the starving are fundamentally noble and sublime. To feel sorry for people based on superficialities is a grave insult to them. We must learn to respect everyone and serve everyone. And this is very important in terms of the notion of the inherent Buddha nature. Just because people don't have money or are living what we might consider a low level of existence, that doesn't mean that they are less than a wealthy person. Because what really is the identity is what in Buddhism we talk about as the Buddha nature, and that is the same for everyone. So if you feel sorry for people in poverty, that is actually an insult to them because you think that you're somehow better than they are just because you have more money. And that's not how people are judged or beings are judged in Buddhism. Take a good look at yourself. This age of rampant materialism is harming you. You are the ocean itself, yet you are only paying attention to the spray from the waves. Dwell on the ocean. Another very famous image that is used particularly in Chinese Buddhism. Take a good look at yourself. The Buddha did not appear in this world to save us. This is very important. Buddha is not a savior. He came to teach us that we are already saved, originally saved. What a tremendous joy it is for us to believe, for us to live with this truth. So let's all bless everything together. So the people have gathered for the master to bless them, but based on the egalitarianism of Buddhism and Buddha nature, everyone is able to bless everyone else and the entire universe. Any questions about that? Again, an example of non-pessimism in Buddhism. Suffering there is something that can be dealt with, not something that we are inhibited by. So just to expand on the notion of real compassion, this is from Krishnamurti, not self-identified as a Buddhist, but his philosophy resonates with Buddhism. And how do we actually implement this in our own lives? So he tells about a woman who lost her husband and is very depressed. And then she goes to K. Krishnamurti is referred to by his people around him as K. He talks to her, she talks to him about her sorrow. And so she asks her, last night, did you hear that man groaning and crying out in pain on the road outside the window? He was in such agony. She said she hadn't heard him. Why? Because she was internally mentating. She was thinking only about her own suffering. Kay told her, and all of us, until you can feel another's pain, you can never get over your own sorrow. And this actually is a modern retelling of one of the most famous stories, the mustard seed story in Buddhist literature. Buddha is teaching a woman who refuses to accept the death of her child. So she comes to the Buddha and she asks for his help because she will not acknowledge the fact that her child is gone. Now, he doesn't send her away, but he tells her that, yes, I can help you, but she has to do something first. So she has to become actively engaged in this process. He sends her out there looking for mustard seeds that come from a house that has not experienced any death. That is, that has not endured the experience that she's struggling with. So she goes out there and she starts knocking on doors, one house after another house. So how does this relate to the previous story with Krishnamurti and the woman who had become a widow? What is this woman going to find when she starts knocking on the doors looking for those mustard seeds?
Suffering, like what she's going through. Everyone had some kind of death.
So in his own way, yeah, he's redirecting her attention from her pain to the fact that this is a pain that is actually shared and therefore something that cannot be avoided. It's how do you deal with it? So he doesn't lecture her. He doesn't tell her, oh, buck up, get over it. He gets her engaged so that she can try to figure it out for herself, and eventually she does. She doesn't go back to the Buddha because she has no mustard seeds, but she has come to some resolution with her loss. And that's the same kind of teaching that we'll find throughout his text. So this is upaya, skillful means. Instead of, as we said, just trying to give people the truth, you set up the conditions under which they can come to the realization on their own, which is much more powerful. For her to just tell her, for the Buddha to just tell her, well, you know, I can't do anything. This is how life is. Get over it. It is what it is. That's not going to satisfy her. She has to come to that realization herself. So he is able to give her something, but he can't give her the child back. So he's not a miracle maker. So this relates to the story about the pebbles and the ghee in the Vipassana text, which is also about the grieving process. So the son there, was anybody remember that story, the pebbles and the ghee? Didn't get to that chapter yet. Now the son is trying to do something to help his father who has died. And as it turns out, there's nothing he can do. We cannot fix things because some things are just part of the natural process. So as the text says, the earlier we understand the law of nature and start living in accordance with the law rather than trying to find some kind of miracle to overcome what happens, the earlier we will come out of our misery. So the misery is created by our unwillingness to accept the facts of natural law. So all three cases we've just looked at fit into that same category. We're trying to make the world change according to our own imagining of what would make it more perfect. We're rejecting reality.
I have a quick question. Is the ghee the same as butter? Because I think I read that story, but
yes, ghee is a refined form of butter.
Okay.
So if you go to the dairy part of the grocery, you'll find it's the most expensive dairy product because it has the highest content of fat.
Heck yeah, thank you.
So Master Kukai, in the text, Attaining Enlightenment in This Very Existence, so you don't have to wait, says the stage of joy is not the first stage of the bodhisattvahood, but the first stage of our Buddha vehicle. So when you experience the joy, that emotional high, which is even better than happiness, then you find that you are at the beginning of being a Buddha. And this is an example of a Buddhist monk who has what we call in the Lotus Sutra a mind dancing with joy. He's not just happy, right? How would you interpret that look on his face? Yes, we meet twice a week for Zoom. Yeah, Tuesday, Thursday. It's our chat. That's not just happiness. How would you describe that look?
Looks like he's something good has happened and he's celebrating.
Yes, he's totally into it. This is fantastic.
Especially with his arms up. Yeah, seems like he's something great has happened and he's overjoyed.
Yes, yes. He's transported and he's on a boat and he has just liberated some lobsters that were supposed to be eaten at a restaurant.
He saved somebody's life because in Buddhism,
yes,
they feel like it's wrong to eat whatever that was once alive, right? That's why all of them are vegetarians.
Well, it's wrong to kill in order to eat. So it's a very interesting, subtle point in Buddhism. We talk about them as being vegetarians, but the real source of what is interpreted as vegetarianism is ahimsa. You cannot injure other beings. And in order to eat them, you have to kill them. That doesn't mean that on occasion the Buddha would in fact eat meat if it was something that was offered to him, as long as it had not been killed for him. So for example,
yes. Go ahead, Professor. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to say that if something like roadkill, something that's killed on the road, it just was an accident. So you had not been part of the injury to that being.
Oh, okay. So if the food was offered to them, regardless if it's meat or not, they can eat it as long as they're not the one who killed it.
That was the way.
Because I remember the way the Buddha died was because he ate some really bad meat or something. That was the cause of his death.
That's one of the stories, yes. So in India, that was how the restrictions on diet were interpreted. When Buddhism gets to East Asia, particularly to China, then they see it as a more strict vegetarian option. So there's a realignment of the understanding and has something to do with culture.
Okay. So yeah, I can see why he's really happy he saved a life.
Yes. Yeah. So that's not just happy, that's joy. That's what we're going for here. Happiness is not good enough. We're looking for the joy. And so that would seem to provide very clear-cut evidence that Buddhism is not pessimistic. What do you think? That's what the first misconception that Inada points to, which he sees as the biggest and most damaging. And once people get that in their minds, they think, oh, this is a really bad kind of philosophy to have. It doesn't look like it's much fun at all. But if you look at this monk, it goes way beyond just happiness. Any comments about that? Elation, yeah, that's been suggested, yes.
Yeah, it almost seems like he was kind of wrapped up in like a robe. I'm not sure what's really around his elbow right there. Maybe a bag. He even had the lobster in there, but it almost seems like he just kind of like ripped his robe off of excitement. Like, heck yeah, we just saved these lobsters.
Yes, yes. Yeah. So that's what Buddhism is actually aiming for, if you want to put it that way.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So Buddhism is aiming for joy, but is it aiming for like moments of joy or like a overall joyous life?
Excellent question. And that actually ties in with the meditation process. And in those scientific studies, the happiness reflected in the brains of the meditators was not restricted only to the time when they're meditating. So it is pretty much a 7/24 experience.
Okay, thank you.
So that brings us to our commentary of the week. So do you agree with Inada that the biggest and most damaging misconception of Buddhism is that which applies to the label of pessimism, which is grounded in the misreading of the Fourfold Noble Truth? Is this the biggest marketing problem that Buddhism has? Because when people think, oh yeah, life is suffering, so let's just move on and find something better. So if you agree, why would you agree? And if you disagree, why do you disagree?
Just a quick question. What's the difference between joy and contentment in Buddhism?
Well, let's take a look at that picture. This guy is not just content. He is joyous. And I think the contentment is more, might seem like some kind of a balance, to know that enough.
So is it more like contentment, you must have contentment in order to lead to joy? Like contentment with your surroundings, contentment with your current situation in order to find joy?
There is beyond joy something that they talk about as equanimity.
Okay.
If we equate equanimity with contentment, then that would seem to be the next level beyond joy. But contentment in and of itself, it's kind of a mediocre term that at least in English. So I think I'd have to see what might be the equivalent, let's say in Sanskrit or Chinese.
Okay.
That people don't usually aim for contentment, let's say.
Yeah. Because contentment, like you said in the English language, is like one step below joy.
Yes, so. I think that's how we would tend to regard it. But this higher level, this is something called the four exalted dwellings. It starts with human-heartedness, moves to compassion, compassion moves to joy, and joy leads to equanimity. We'll be talking more about that actually in a few weeks when we look at the Kalama Sutta.
Okay.
So that level, it kind of sustains the joy. So this guy's got an outburst of joy, but how do you keep that, as a previous question seemed to imply, that 7/24? Can you keep that going? And that would be where the equanimity comes in. I also have a very interesting picture of the same group of monks. They're riding on a roller coaster. And then they're at the top and they've got their hands up and they got these huge smiles on at the same time. I might post that one online. Very interesting. Just having the ability to experience this kind of joyous emotion requires us to get outside of our internal mentation. So next time we're going to pick it up with the misconceptions. So our next one is going to be heaven and hell. So we should finish those up, and that's on the PowerPoint we started out with, and then wrap up the Inada article. So if you have any questions about, we obviously can't cover everything in the article, but there are many very important philosophical insights about Buddhism that Inada has put into that article. So any other questions at this point? Okay, so we'll pick it up there on Thursday.
Thank you.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day. Stay safe.
You too, yes.